Welcome to Shared Practices. We are here in Scottsdale, Arizona at the headquarters of Shared Practices during our analytics-based practice management course. And I'm privileged to have some new friends here that are here talking to our dentists and actually blew my mind a couple months ago when we met each other at the DEO event. Where was that?
San Diego.
San Diego. That was in San Diego. I want to introduce Brannon. Did I say it? Brannon?
You got it.
Oh, goodness. It's the names that have multiple spellings that throw me off. Brannon Moncrief from McLaren and Associates, CEO of McLaren and Associates. You're a friend now and someone who we've been referring clients to that we're working with, and we've seen some amazing results and some experiences so far. But introduce yourself for our audience. You know, what is McLaren and Associates? What do you do, and how did you get into this whole world?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Richard. So I've got 22 years of experience in the dental industry. I spent the first decade as a banker lending money to dentists across the country to buy and start and grow practices. And about 12 years ago, I decided I wanted to leave banking but stay in the dental industry. So at that time, I moved from Houston to Austin and purchased McLaren and Associates. And at that time, it was a small kind of mom and pop practice brokerage firm, like a lot of them that you see out there today, focused on doing doctor-to-doctor practice sales. They were doing probably, 10, 15 maybe, private practice sales a year, specifically in Texas. And we scaled that business, built it up to become the largest practice brokerage firm in Texas. And then about 5 years ago, when we saw private equity come into our industry very, very quickly, very, very fast, especially being in Texas, we were kind of on the forefront of that wave of consolidation. We made a conscious decision to build out a process and a team to help large practice owners nationwide who are considering going down the DSO private equity path, maximize their outcome. Just ensure that they were educated about their options, they created competition and optionality, and ultimately they found the right DSO partner, maximize their valuation, maximize their deal structure. So that's the team that I lead on a daily basis. We have 5 dedicated team members across the country that do nothing but play in that sandbox, helping large practice owners go down the DSO path. And we do about 30 to 40 DSO private equity transactions all over the country every year. And then we have another division of our company, kind of our legacy business that focuses on doctor-to-doctor practice sales, specifically in Texas. So we do about 50 to 60 private practice sales. So I'm one of the few individuals that understands both sides of the space, the traditional practice sale model as well as the DSO and private equity model. But it's been a lot of fun watching the company evolve and scaling the business. We now have offices all across the country, HQ in Austin, office in San Diego, as well as an office in Atlanta. And then watching the business evolve, but also watching the industry evolve and scaling and evolving our business alongside that.
That's awesome. It's funny because we do buyer's representation, and we help dentists who are trying to buy into that first practice. And we felt like, okay, this was a space that was underrepresented. And I remember in dental school, I got my real estate license on the side because I'm an idiot during second year of dental school, and there was this moment where they talked about like dual representation, where a realtor can represent both the buyer and the seller at the same time. And I was like, this seems a little tricky because like you have information about the home that like maybe you do or don't convey, but then you're also representing the buyer and like you're trying to get the most money for the seller, but you're trying to get the best deal for the buyer. Like this seems like a sticky situation. And that was just like the light bulb moment for me of like, oh, anytime you're doing a major transaction, I want someone with more experience than me representing me and maximizing my value. And I want their motives to align with mine versus when a realtor is representing both sides, they want the deal to get done as quickly as possible, that. And all of a sudden it gets a little muddy. And so the fact that you guys have, okay, we've done dentist to dentist sales. We've represented sellers and helped them in this transition phase. But now you've also said, okay, we're going to help dentists maximize the opportunity if they are going to sell to a group. That is its own niche, and your average broker who's working on this dentist to dentist world is not going to understand how to maximize that and how to kind of play this space, because it's a new space. I mean, 20 years ago, did this even exist? Like, was DSO sales a thing 20 years ago in the same way it is now?
Before we keep going, I'd like to continue the conversation that I've been having with you guys about the Practice by Numbers all-in-one platform. We talked about why we went from Dental Intel to Practice by Numbers, the development rate and the speed of growth in that platform, and I talked about the platform, the all-in-one solution for all of your software needs. For the second ad, you might have heard, we talked about subscription fatigue, how you can actually save money by switching to Practice by Numbers for a more efficient, better experience. In the third ad, I really want to talk about the workflow and what a PBN integrated office looks like, because office managers are a lot of times the biggest impediment to the implementation of software products. What's possible on the other side of that friction is a smoother, more well-run practice that is much more informed on what's happening. Think about it right now. If a patient walks into your office, you can have your digital forms go straight into the practice management software without needing to scan anything. We can have all patient communication go through that same platform, so we can integrate the way that we do follow-ups with our online booking, where if we have a patient overdue for our cleaning, 6 months past, we don't have to have an office manager or a treatment coordinator or somebody call that patient. We can just have PBN text that patient a link to schedule, and they can just schedule their appointment when they're overdue, saving our staff time and increasing the number of bookings we have. You can already see how having all of the different things that a software service companies offer you in a singular platform allows them to be integrated for, in my opinion, a much better result. The all-in-one is not just about saving money, it's also about having a more efficient experience where the different features talk to each other much more effectively. So go to practicebynumbers.com to learn about all the different things that they do and to get updated pricing on there.
Was DSO sales a thing 20 years ago in the same way it is now?
Not really, not in the same way it is now. DSO version 1.0, most of those DSOs, they were backed by institutional capital, private equity, but they were focused more on the de novo model, kind of the doc in the box, clinical model. They really developed all the systems. The doctors and staff were employees.
Right.
Doctors didn't really own any equity in the business. And that model, for the most part, failed miserably. There's a handful of those DSOs still left that have done well and scaled that model and reached a point where I don't think they're going to fail. But this new iteration of DSOs is focused on buying quality practices, partnering with great doctors, and not trying to reinvent the wheel. They allow for a lot of clinical autonomy, a lot of operational autonomy. They are designed to kind of support the practice behind the veil, leverage economies of scale. They can get better pricing with vendors. They can get better reimbursement rates with payers. And they don't rebrand the practice. It's not patient facing.
Right.
And they allow, like I said, a lot of clinical autonomy, really pure clinical autonomy. And they just help with the administrative functions of the practice. The practice owner can offload a lot of the things they don't enjoy doing, right? HR, payroll, benefits administration, procuring supplies and equipment. If they want to expand and build out a new space, construction, things of that, bookkeeping, accounting, legal, compliance, all the things that dentists don't enjoy doing, on a daily basis. And you made a good point earlier. The traditional broker, the traditional sell-side advisor doesn't really understand the DSO space.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the Wild West, and it's highly unregulated. Anything goes. And when we made the conscious decision as a company to pivot into this space, we spent about 18 months doing research on private equity, on DSOs, flying around the country, meeting with all the C-level executives at the different DSOs to get educated before we went to the market with a defined process, and we began to educate doctors regarding what this side of the space looks like. So that was a lot of fun. It was very eye-opening. And the reason we got involved in this side of the space, I pounded the table for quite some time and said, hey, we're going to keep private practice private. We're not going to sell any of our listings to DSOs. But we realized that this was not going to go away. It was not going to fade into the background. Once private equity comes into an industry, they pump a ton of time, energy, and money in, and they're in it for the long haul. So we realized that we could pound the table all we wanted, but the reality was this was going to happen with or without us. Thousands of dentists every year were going to choose to sell their practice to DSOs without proper representation and do a deal in the dark, let the DSOs control the narrative. And by its nature, private equity is relatively predatory.
Yeah.
Right? You would probably do the same thing they do if you were in that position. Their goal is to buy low and sell high. And we realized that dentists weren't educated. They didn't understand their options. They weren't creating competition. And they were leaving a lot of money on the table. And that's why we evolved our business. And we've done some amazing things for our clients since.
Yeah. Well, and this like selling to a DSO is such like an emotionally charged thing to even talk about. It's almost like even saying the word sales in dentistry. I love Dan Pink's book, To Sell is Human. And this idea that like every interaction that we have with people is sales. We are influencing others. We're influencing their decisions, their opinions, how they think, how they feel. And like he talks about in healthcare, he talks about another thing, like this term selling is not a dirty word. It's not this. So like, we talk about this in case acceptance of like your patients, they're evaluating, do I spend money on my mouth or do I go on a cruise?
Absolutely.
Do I invest in, the needed treatment that's going to be the best for me long term, or do I buy this piece of electronics? And so we have to be understanding how people think and how people feel. And so anyways, I think the same sort of stigma that the word sales gets within dentistry, DSOs also get within dentistry of like, I talk with dentists who they're on the other side of this transition. They've sold to a DSO 1, 2, 3 years ago. And they're like, I'm happier than I have ever been in my practice. And then I talk to other ones who, they didn't have a great experience. And there's some negative experiences. And there's like emotion around what this means and what this is. So I think one of the problems is people tend to wrap this whole concept into one thing. And it's not. Just like every private practice is different than every other private practice, every DSO is different than every other DSO.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the deal structure, and we're going to get into all that. We're going to talk about these over episodes and kind of the pros and cons and the things that you've learned and seen from your clients over time. But I just don't think it's fair to lump it all into just one ball and like ship it all off as like, this is bad for the profession as a whole, or this is bad for an individual as a whole. There are good things and there are bad things about this. And understanding it is what allows people to make educated decisions about, is this a transition goal for me? Is this something that is a tool for me at a phase of my life? Or is this something that I don't want to do because of other reasons? And that's okay. Like if you want no part of the DSO world, that's totally fine. But understanding that world helps you make that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, it's a lightning rod topic.
Yes.
No doubt. And for a long time when we were meeting with our potential clients, sellers, we wouldn't even bring up the word DSO. And for a long time, I would also argue it wasn't a viable option. The DSOs today, DSO version 2.0, is a much better path for doctors rather than DSO version 1.0. But we wouldn't even bring it up for fear of the fact that they would tell us to, get the hell out of their office.
Kick rocks, get out of here.
Yeah, it definitely had that negative stigma. But like you said, I mean, look, there's crappy private practices.
Yes.
There's crappy DSOs, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So they're not all created equal. And I do think that it makes sense, regardless if you're looking to sell to a DSO now or down the road, or you're planning to own a private practice for 30 years, you need to understand what's happening, right, in the industry today, because it is evolving rapidly. And a lot of that evolution is driven by the DSO and private equity side of the space. So I think understanding what's happening from a global perspective, irregardless if you choose to go down that path, it helps you understand your world better. And it helps you make decisions better on a daily basis in your own practice. So I always start any conversation like this saying, I'm not here to convince anyone to sell to a DSO.
Right.
My job, first and foremost, is to educate. Life is about options and opportunities. And I'm here to just unlock those. And whatever you decide to do with your practice, I totally respect it. I just want you to do it with your eyes wide open.
So on that note, I think there is also a sense there can be put out by people that like there's this wave or this like first opportunity, like consolidation. If you don't do it now, it's going to get like people will talk from both sides of their mouth. They'll say that like, oh, the whole market's going to get consolidated anyways. And then they'll say, well, there's this scarcity on the other side. If you don't do it now, you're going to miss out. Well, what about all this consolidation you're saying is going to happen on an ongoing basis? And I remember even 7 years ago when I started shared practices, there was groups at the time who were bundling together practices that they're like, we're building this up and then we're going to sell it off. And if you don't catch this wave, you're going to kind of miss out. So I want to hear your version of like, where is the market right now? Are we done with consolidation? Is it all over, or is there so much more to go? Or is the EBITDA multipliers, they're going up, they're going down? Where are we right now?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of rhetoric in the space about sell now or die.
Right.
Basically, and that rhetoric is being controlled by a number of people that have an agenda. Typically, it's brokers that are trying to convince you to sell your practice to a DSO, maybe prematurely, or maybe sell to the wrong DSO. And then DSOs are driving that narrative that they're going to consolidate the space. You either get on board or you're going to get crushed. And I think the worst decision you can make is to hit the panic button and make a fear-based decision.
Yeah.
You should never make decisions predicated upon fear or panic.
Yeah.
And I think we are seeing a lot of that go on, driven by that narrative. So a lot of people ask, like, how consolidated is the industry? How consolidated is it going to get? And the reality is that nobody really has a good framework, has a good answer. The data is confusing. Half the practices in the country do less than $1 million in revenue. Those practices don't generate any EBITDA, and they're not acquisition targets for a DSO. So that part of the marketplace will always exist. Dentistry, to some degree, will always be kind of a boutique cottage industry because private equity isn't interested in buying those smaller offices. Now, I will say some of those, 3-4 op practices doing $300,000 or $400,000 a year that are legacy practices, 30 years old, they've never done more than revenue than that, they're going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah.
They're going to either, close and those patients will be absorbed into nearby offices, or they'll be acquired by larger nearby offices and merged. But the reality that some people try to create in that private practice is dying and the industry is eventually going to be 70 to 80% consolidated, I don't buy into that narrative, and here's why. I think a lot of people on the DSO side of the space, they're operating in their own echo chamber. They look at dentistry as if it has a finite number of practices, and many of those practices are currently being acquired by DSOs and private equity. So every time a practice is purchased, the industry gets more consolidated. The thing they don't have perspective into, that you do and I do, because we also operate in the private practice space, is that, yes, every day 2 or 3 offices are selling to DSOs. At the same time, every day entrepreneurial dentists are opening practices and buying practices.
Right.
So the supply that's being acquired by DSOs is being replaced by young entrepreneurial doctors that are taking the leap and starting their own business. So for that reason, I think private practice has a very long runway. I don't foresee that PE, that DSOs are going to be the ultimate end game.
Yeah. And I also do think that I love the point you made, and you just made it now. You made it to me before we started recording. There's a bunch of solo offices that are 400 to 800K that like no DSO, no private equity has any interest in at all. And some of those are worth it for an individual to acquire because maybe they can grow it. There is some EBITDA there if they were tweaked a few things, if they've got the ops to be able to grow into a little bit bigger practice. But as soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, there's like a whole segment of this industry that just like is non-lendable from a private equity banking standpoint for these DSOs. And like that is not going away. Yes, they might get pressured and squeezed, and some of them will retire and won't have a seller or a buyer. But that's not disappearing. It's not going away overnight. And as you said, the market is being replaced over time by new dentists starting new offices. So
I do think I want to make a point there.
Yeah.
It is a dangerous lane to be in, right? Doing solo practice, doing $400,000 to $800,000 a year. There are some headwinds against the industry that you're going to face.
Yes.
Upward pressure on overhead, downward pressure on pricing. The DSOs through their economies of scale are leveraging the payers and leveraging the vendors for preferential treatment, and in turn, it's pressuring the private side of the space.
Yes.
So I do think private practice has to evolve to some degree. That single doctor 3 to 4 op model, I don't think will survive long term. There has to be a push towards group practice.
Yep.
And, it's the pathway that shared practices is walking your dentist down, is becoming, a mega practice, 3, 4 doctors. Then you have the size, you have the top line revenue to push against a lot of those headwinds and generate sustainability long term from a profitability perspective as well as from a lifestyle perspective. So while I don't think private practice is dying, I do think it needs to evolve, and it needs to pay attention to the trends on the DSO private equity side of the space, because there are lessons to be learned there.
It has to. And just as there are, like we said, there's variations in private practice owners and how good of an operator they are. There's also variations in how poorly some of these DSOs operate. There will be a time that some of these DSOs that have consolidated fall apart, that like they fail, or that stuff hits the fan. As some of them have been doing things unsustainably and they aren't good operators, and then the owner doctors turn over and they are left holding the bag, and they've got offices that aren't profitable. And I've seen it in Indiana. I've seen a DSO with 11 locations close their doors overnight.
Yeah.
And those will create vacuums where private practice owners can fill in those spaces and create opportunities or scoop up some real estate or a former practice of one of these DSOs. So I 100% agree with the sky is falling notion being served up by the DSOs, by the industry, and by people who benefit from that narrative.
Right. And I think you bring up a great segue into what's going on in the DSO space today, because we are at an inflection point where a lot of what you just described is happening. So we're in a completely different environment from a macroeconomic and fiscal perspective than we were even a year ago.
Yeah.
And it has put private equity as well as DSOs under a tremendous amount of pressure. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about rapidly rising interest rates.
Yep.
Interest rates have gone up faster in the past 18 months than they have in the history of the U.S., the history of the Fed. And we've got tightening capital markets. Banks are more reluctant to lend. We've also had DSOs that have been fueled by heavily leveraged private equity firms that are living on short-term debt. A lot of it's floating rate, that are now, under a lot of pressure. Their cost of capital has doubled, and their availability of capital has waned, considerably. Combine that with the fact that there were 250 DSOs pre-COVID, and then those DSOs coming out of COVID doubled down and started buying practices at an insanely fast clip and paying premium multiples for them. There are also a lot of new private equity firms that entered the space post-COVID because dentistry proved not only to be recession-proof, which is done again and again, but it proved to be pandemic-approved. So for that reason, private equity already loved dentistry, and they loved it even more post-COVID. So as these DSOs acquired practices at a faster and faster clip, they didn't build the infrastructure to keep up with the practices that they were buying. So they weren't fully integrating these businesses. They didn't really intend to operate them long term. And now they're kind of caught with their pants down in the sense that they may not have built them to be sustainable. They were on a 3 to 5 year recap cycle. Well, guess what? Before they could hit the recap, they hit this inflection point where there's not a lot of institutional buyers in the marketplace today. The IPOs are on hold. The recaps are on hold. The cost of capital is higher than it's been over the past 20 years. And it's hard to get access to capital.
Right.
So we're at that that reckoning. We're kind of at that inflection point, which I think is going to be healthy for the industry long term, but painful in the short term for some DSOs. So some DSOs are not buying practices. They don't have capital, or they're over their skis operationally. So that's been a marked change compared to the past few years when money was loose, it was cheap, and you could buy as many practices as you want, as fast as you want, at whatever multiples you wanted to pay, because there was a buyer standing there on the back end that was saying, hey, I'll pay 13, 14, 15 times when it's time for you to recap. And the public markets were, anxiously awaiting, Heartland MB2 and a few others going IPO.
Right.
But that's changed. That climate has changed dramatically. Now,
I want to explain, I want to digest some of that for some of our listeners, because I think there's a lot of like terms and concepts here that maybe the average dentist, like this is just kind of off of like what they're thinking about. So you talk about the cost of capital. When a private equity firm buys a DSO and they provide money for that DSO to go buy more practices, that private equity group has to get that money. They leverage it. They get a loan for a large amount of money, and they say, here you go, DSO. We're going to buy you out some portion. We're going to give you money. That money is, like you said, often a floating interest rate. So it's not like a home loan that you fix it in at 2.5% and now you're just good for 30 years and you can sleep really well about it. Those floating interest rates, now all of a sudden, this huge $50 million loan is not at 3%. It's at 6%. It's at 8%. It's higher than that. So their costs just skyrocketed, and the amount of extra money that they can get, and all of this paying really high multipliers for a single practice only makes sense. And this is where I get frustrated with the consolidation process, is when the only reason this makes sense to buy this practice for this amount is I am planning on churning and burning, and in 3 to 5 years, selling this to someone else at an even higher EBITDA multiplier, but I haven't added any value to that original practice. And once the owner doc leaves, that practice is likely to go down in value because they're not the producer, and whoever replaces that owner, it is hard to assume that whoever replaces an owner of a 20-year practice is going to produce at a higher level, is going to be more operationally effective. And so that, like, this all made sense as long as the numbers keep going up. And if the numbers stop going up, which they have, and everything's more expensive, now it starts to come crashing down, and some of them are in trouble, and the numbers that used to be available are just no longer available in terms of the EBITDA multipliers.
Well, it's been a really, really interesting year. So we expected 2023 to be a difficult year. We knew interest rates were already high and they were going to continue to escalate. We knew the capital markets were tightening. We knew that some DSOs were probably over their skis from a leverage perspective and or operationally. The interesting thing has been that, I'll say a third of kind of the legacy DSOs that were acquiring practices at a fast clip over the past 5 years are on standby. They're not buying practices right now. They either need to catch up from an integration operational perspective, or they need to recapitalize, they need a new financial sponsor, they need a new bank before they can grow. Now, at the same time, we've had a lot of emerging DSOs, smaller DSOs, 5, 10, 15, 20 locations that were privately owned that have taken on private equity capital and have a fresh line of debt and still have had plenty of money to spend. So they've kind of stepped up to fill the gap that some of the legacy DSOs have left by being on the sidelines. So as a result, we haven't seen demand drop off a cliff, nor have we seen valuations drop off a cliff.
Okay.
Valuations ticked up substantially post-COVID, and they've really remained near an all-time high. I would say, we might be a little bit lower than the peak, but we haven't seen valuations fall off a cliff. Now, I will say that DSOs are more selective because they're being scrutinized by their lenders, by their private equity firms, and by the institutional investors on the back end when they go to recap. So the deals that had some hair on them that were more difficult to get done or very difficult to get done, they've seen the most movement, sideways or backwards from a pricing perspective. But the quality assets, owned by younger doctors, EBITDA of $600,000-700,000 plus, that have potential for growth, that are located in good geographies, we're still seeing rock solid demand and rock solid valuations. But, the sketchier assets where maybe the doctor's older, doesn't have much room, much runway before they exit. Maybe the practice has just certain aspects about it that are not ideal. Those practices are harder to move and have definitely taken a hit from a valuation perspective.
Well, and shared practices on our podcast in the past, we've talked about valuation quite a bit. And we talked about how in season 2, when we originally started talking about this, we talked about this like imperfection between how the industry used to value dental practices as a percentage of collection and how bad of a metric that is to value a practice at, and that really we should be looking at profitability. A $1 million practice that kicks off $100,000 of profit versus a $1 million practice that kicks off $300,000 of practice or of profit. Those are two very different practices and should be valued accordingly. And for a long time in the industry, there was kind of this discrepancy between what the ideal profitability valuation would be and what the percentage of collections. That like it's going away more and more and more and more. So there's less like practices where you're like they're not being valued properly, and there's a deal to scoop up on. But describe for our listeners real quick, EBITDA multipliers when you're talking with a DSO. That is all we're looking at. Is we are looking at the amount of EBITDA the practice kicks off, the amount of true profit after paying doctors and expenses, but before depreciation and taxes, and then we're multiplying that by a number. And so that's what and that is the amount that the practice is sold for. So talk with me through like a large single site 5 years ago. What were the ranges up to pre-COVID, and then post-COVID, what were the kind of all-time highs of post-COVID, and what are they looking at like right now? So what are these EBITDA multiplier ranges that we're dealing with?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point before we go there.
Sure.
In the difference between the perspective of valuing a practice from a private buyer perspective versus a DSO perspective, because they're night and day. And I do agree with you. I think it was a terrible benchmark in the private buyer world to value practices from a percentage of revenue perspective.
Yeah.
Honestly, the reason that people do it is because they're lazy, and it's just easy.
It's easy
to use that as a benchmark.
And banks were often annoying in that like it was a big deal for them. Like if something's 80 or 90% of collections, they feel comfortable up to a certain point, and beyond a certain point, they feel less comfortable. And so sometimes the bank was driving some of the valuation possibilities.
Yeah, and I'm a former banker. It really didn't make any sense. And I would get frustrated with our banking partners when they wouldn't lend 90 or 100% on collections for a practice that has 50% profitability.
Why would you not? Yeah.
Yeah, they would lend 75 or 80% of revenue on that practice, and they'd lend 75 to 80% of revenue on the same top line revenue practice with only 30% profitability.
So
that
dumb.
Makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
So when we look at valuation from a private buyer perspective in our business, yeah, we always look at the benchmark. Average practice sells for 70 to 80% of revenue. Maybe that's like a limiting factor. But we also look at net cash flow before doctor compensation, and typically we're looking at 2 to 2.5 times is what a practice should trade for in the private buyer world.
Yep.
So 70 to 80% of revenue. In some markets, it might go all the way up to 100% of revenue. And 2 to 2.5 times net cash flow.
Yep.
Those are kind of the private buyer metrics. But
Yep.
when we're talking about valuation from a DSO perspective, EBITDA is everything. And for those that don't know, EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation, amortization. What that essentially means is top line revenue minus real overhead, right? We've got to sift out any personal expenses,
Sure.
discretionary expenses, non-recurring expenses.
You mean dentists run things through the practice that they're not supposed to?
I've seen all kinds of crazy. So we could have a podcast episode alone about all the stuff.
But I do think
run through a practice.
I think that like if you are preparing to sell to a DSO, how funny you get with your practice finances is going to help or hurt you in that situation. If you've run a very clean set of books and your EBITDA is real versus I've paid every family member and I've like done every random thing through the practice, it gets a lot murkier and you have to do a lot of backpedaling to like get to that clean EBITDA amount.
It's a lot more work. It's a lot more arguing with the DSOs.
They have more justification to pay you less because they're like, well, no, on paper, here's what the EBITDA was declared as.
Absolutely. Look, I own McLaren and I understand the game, right? I mean, the goal is to pay as little in taxes as you possibly can. But once you get within that trailing 12-month window of potentially selling your business, whether you're selling it to a private buyer or selling it to a DSO, it pays to clean up your financials and be a little bit more conservative in your approach to writing off discretionary personal expenses through your business, just so that the DSOs as well as your advisors have a better line of sight into what the profitability actually looks like.
Yep.
So going back to EBITDA, EBITDA is essentially top line revenue minus real overhead expenses minus doctor compensation. Well, you would have to pay a doctor, whether that's yourself or somebody else, to produce that dentistry. Oftentimes, that's the mistake that a lot of people make when they calculate EBITDA. They don't factor in the doctor compensation.
Right.
So
this is how, that's why I hate the percentage overhead number that like gets thrown out, is it's like, okay, do you have another doctor? Are you including their compensation or not? Are you including your compensation? So you'll hear someone say, oh, I've got 60% overhead. Or if someone has 65% overhead, but they would pay a doctor 35%, they've got zero EBITDA.
Exactly. And oftentimes I'll have somebody call me and say, hey, I'm thinking about selling my practice to a DSO. I've got $1 million in top line revenue, 40% profit. My EBITDA is $400,000. And I'm like, if that's the case, that's one of the most profitable $1 million revenue practices I've ever seen. By the way, did you pay yourself to do the dentistry when you calculated EBITDA? And they're like, oh, wait, I got to pay myself. All right. So your EBITDA is actually $150,000, not $400,000. And then when we do the math, oftentimes a practice that small makes more sense to sell to a private buyer than a DSO.
Right.
So let's compare private buyer valuations to DSO valuations. So DSO valuations always start with EBITDA, and then we have to apply an appropriate multiple to that EBITDA predicated upon a number of different factors. The size of the practice from an EBITDA perspective, more EBITDA typically means a higher multiple. How many doctors? Is there key man risk? Has the production been bifurcated between multiple providers, or is it a super GP producing all the dentistry?
Right.
Type of patient base, type of dentistry.
Which interestingly, so when you look at a private buyer, if you've got that super GP, that's a red flag for me as a private buyer, because I'm like, as soon as I buy this, it's going to drop in value because I can't do what he or she is doing in this office. Do DSOs feel the same way, that key man risk of like a super high solo producer, they're going to have to like back away a little bit because of that risk factor?
Their ears are definitely going to perk up. Okay. So they're definitely going to pay very close attention if you're a super GP practice. How old are you? Why are you selling? What's your runway to exit? Are you open to bringing on associates and bifurcating that key man risk and spreading around some of that productivity? Otherwise, what happens if you're on the tail end of your career, or your plan is to eventually relocate, or you have a health issue, right? Key man risk is a big deal for DSOs. So it's one of the things that impacts the multiple. Typically a younger doctor with more runway to retirement is going to fetch a higher multiple than an older doctor that's closer to retirement.
Which I think this is, as you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, I think this is a real shift in like the mentality around creating a business and selling a business to create retirement level income. This has shifted to an earlier point in people's careers than it was before. Before it was just like cash flow and own your business the whole time. And then at the tail end, you sell it as like your last little cherry on top of retirement. Maybe it's a quarter or a half, whatever percentage of your retirement that practice sale is. It seems more and more, because the DSOs value that younger dentist who is going to be kind of more likely to stay on that practice long term. This whole conversation has shifted earlier.
No doubt. Our average client age has decreased dramatically. So our average client up until a few years ago was, I'd say, 60 years old, and selling for an exit planning strategy, right? But we're now working with a lot of clients that are in their late 30s to late 40s that have owned a successful practice for 10, 15 years. They've built a beast, and they're managing 20 plus employees. They're managing multiple doctors. They've got multi-million-dollar revenue, and they've got a lot of their net worth tied up in that business. Yeah. And they're at a point where they want to take some chips off the table, and they want a little bit better quality of life. They want some help from an operational administrative perspective. So they're either looking to do one of two things. They're looking to either step back and, wean themselves out of the chair potentially, and or get some help from an operational perspective,
Yeah.
or they're looking to take a step forward and continue to scale the business, but they don't want to do it on their own. They want to use someone else's capital and someone else's infrastructure to continue to grow the business. So you can use the DSO route for either one of those avenues, taking a step back or leaning into the business and continuing to scale it. But no doubt our client age has gotten younger and younger. I think that's also a product of, COVID was kind of a reckoning for a lot of people where they took a hard look at their priorities. And we've got a lot of young dentists that have sacrificed a lot of their free time, a lot of their family time to build a really successful business. And you've scaled a business, I've scaled a business. It's stressful, right? And you miss out, on a lot of your free time and a lot of your family time. And a lot of doctors are looking to buy back some of that time and to bring on a partner and have a little better quality of life. But if that is your goal, and that's where we always start with our clients, define your why. You've got to define your why before you ever look to walk down the DSO path, because oftentimes that's going to determine what type of buyer you're looking for and what type of deal structure you're looking for. If your why is to get help from an administrative and operational perspective, you damn sure better sell to a DSO that's got infrastructure and has operational
good infrastructure.
pedigree.
Yeah.
Right. They actually know how to help support practices on a daily basis. In that scenario, if that's your why, if that's your goal, you don't want to sell to a DSO that's just nothing more than an aggregate and flip game that really has no infrastructure, because you're going to give up a majority ownership in your business and not get what you wanted in return. So I think it's really, really important that you evaluate, what are your goals, what's your why, before you ever look to entertain interest from DSOs. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of sellers make is, they get a direct mailer or a business development guy from a DSO, knocks on their door, and they start what they think is going to be a casual conversation, and it very quickly ends up in an LOI and a sale, and they really didn't think about why they were going down the DSO road in the first place. And oftentimes they sell prematurely or sell to the wrong DSO.
Well, and I'll save this example. I've got a friend who had to think through this, who's very entrepreneurial and all of this, and the advice I gave him was, it is going to be hard because you're going to give up operational control, and someone is going to tell you whether you can't spend money or not, and you're going to hate that for a little while. Eventually it'll get better, but there is going to be this painful year of just frustration of having a boss. And that absolutely came true. And now he's on the flip side of it, and it's much, much better. He found the right partner. He found the right DSO. He did it all right. It was still hard and painful, but he had the goals. He had the vision. He knew that he wanted to step back clinically, that his current pace was unsustainable long-term. He wanted help recruiting another dentist into that office that could be part of that. And he wanted his money parked in a group that would grow as part of his investment.
Right.
So we're going to get into all of this. I do want to come back to the multiples.
Yeah, let's talk about the valuation. So we talked about private buyer valuations, 70 to 90% of revenue, 2 to 2.5 times cash flow. With DSO transactions, it all starts with EBITDA. We talked about some of the factors that move the needle on EBITDA, but right now you're talking somewhere in the range of 6 to 10 times EBITDA. And it depends on a lot of different factors as to where you're going to trade on that range. But let's just look at an example and compare a private buyer valuation versus a DSO valuation, because this is one of the huge compelling factors why large practice owners are looking to go down the DSO route rather than sell in a more traditional, private practice environment. So top line revenue, $2 million. So we're not talking about, we're talking about a successful, practice with maybe a couple of providers.
Yep, two doctor practice.
$2 million in top line revenue. Let's say EBITDA margin is 25%, so EBITDA is $500,000. So from a private buyer perspective, if you can find a private buyer that has, the financial fortitude, the competence, and the confidence to buy a practice of that caliber, it might trade for $1.6 to $1.7 million.
Yep.
Okay. And when you're looking at going down the DSO path, it all starts with EBITDA. We've got $500,000 in EBITDA. Let's apply a 7 multiple, which is a very achievable multiple in today's environment. That practice is going to trade for a valuation of $3.5 million. So that delta is substantial. It's trading for twice in the DSO world what it would in the private buyer world. And that's what's causing a lot of large practice owners, irregardless of where they're at in their career, to at least give a hard look at the DSO option And then you also have, obviously, the equity component on the DSO transactions, the potential arbitrage opportunity of liquidating that equity alongside your DSO partner at a much higher multiple than you're worth on your own. So your practice might trade for 7 times EBITDA on your own, but as being part of a fully integrated, legit DSO that's going to trade for 12, 13, 15 times EBITDA, essentially overnight, the equity in your business will double in value. So a lot of doctors are interested in that arbitrage opportunity that private equity offers. And, a lot of dentists are not financially in the position where they get invited to that private equity party, right? It's typically only high net worth individuals that have the opportunity to invest in private equity backed alternative investments. But because you have what private equity wants right now, you're being invited, to that party, and you're being allowed to participate in that financial arbitrage. But again, you got to pick the right pony. Not all DSOs are going to be successful. Not all DSOs are going to create arbitrage. That equity does have risk. DSOs, when they're courting you, will put offers in front of you that show that you're going to get a 30x return on your equity through 5 recaps over the next 20 years. I think that's crazy. If to make a decision predicated upon a 20-year 4 recap scenario.
Right.
We typically look at on a 5-year window. What does this look like comparatively speaking? Not selling your practice, holding on to it and maybe selling it to a private buyer 5 years from now at a more traditional practice value versus selling to a DSO now, taking some chips off the table, getting some administrative support, and hitting one successful recap at maybe a 2 to 3x return. How do those two scenarios compare? What I will tell you is, in almost every scenario, if you fetch a good multiple on the DSO side of the equation, on a 5-year window, the DSO sale is going to outrun the no sales scenario. Once you get to about year 7, 7.5, that's where you start to hit a break-even point.
Yeah.
If there's not a secondary recap event, if you don't get that compounding return, the no sales scenario will start to outrun the DSO sales scenario. So I think that's why it's so important to talk about what's your runway, what's your why, how does this look economically compared to your other options? Because that's what life is all about, options and opportunities.
Well, and it actually honestly makes sense, because if you think about a 6x EBITDA multiplier means 6 years of profit.
Exactly.
I get that up front. I get that right now. And if you were like, well, I would hang around and operate my business for another 6 years anyway. Like I'm in it for another 7, 8 years. The math to holding that asset, because you would realize 7, 8 years of profit. You would get 7x EBITDA spread out over 7, 8 years, and then you still hold the asset and you can still sell it at that point. So, I mean, it just makes sense. The timeline horizon of I'm thinking about selling this practice, and no matter what, I want to be done in 3 years. If that's like the thing up front, or maybe no matter what, I want to be done in 5 years, then it's like, okay, the math starts to make more sense in terms of like the most I could get out of my practice on the DSO side. But if you're like, I've got another 10, 15, 20 years in you, you do have options. And
if you have no other compelling why, right?
Yeah,
if it's solely
no
economic,
yeah.
If it's solely economic and you don't have some other compelling reason to look at selling, then yeah. I mean, if it's purely economic and you're like, hey, I could own this for another 10 to 15 years, I'm fine. I don't need administrative help. I'm not stressed out. I'm good. Then it's less compelling. But if you're on shorter than a 7-year window, or you have some other compelling reason why, then in that scenario, it does make a lot of sense to give a hard look at the DSO option.
Okay, cool. No, this is exciting. So I want to have you back, and I want to talk about on our next episode the deal structures that exist, because I think this gets complicated for people, because the deal structure on a private sale is pretty straightforward.
Very straightforward.
You sell the practice, you walk away, you get X amount of money. And it is not the case on the DSO side. So let's walk through on another episode what these look like and how they're structured, and try and understand the pros and cons and the different terms, the different levers that we're dealing with to end up with this total valuation that's being offered. Because I think sometimes people hear 6x, 7x multiplier, and they're thinking, I'm getting that much money right now, cash up front, no clauses, no conditions.
I wish that was the case.
Yeah. So people can get fixated like chasing the multiplier. And if they lose sight of like, what are you actually getting and what's still at risk, they don't understand the deal fully.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely need to talk about, unpacking DSO deal structures. The devil's in the details. And each DSO, there's some nuance involved from DSO to DSO as far as not only like the cultural component, the operational component, the infrastructure component, but also the deal structure component and how, particularly the equity part of the transaction, functions long-term. Because for a lot of people, the second bite of the apple, the liquidity event at recap could be as big or bigger than the initial bite of the apple.
Right.
So picking the right DSO, understanding what are your rights at recap, how does that equity function, not only at recap, but on an ongoing basis, I think is critical. So definitely something we need to unpack. And you did mention something before we wrap that I want to touch on.
Yeah.
And that is, everybody always asks me, Brandon, tell me what's going on with multiples.
Right.
Everybody's so intrigued by the EBITDA multiple conversation.
They want you to lick your finger and stick it in the air and be like, oh, this is like a 9x day.
Right, yeah, right?
Yeah.
Right. Which way is the wind blowing?
Yes.
But what I want people to understand first and foremost is that EBITDA matters more than the multiple. And the number one way that DSOs, private equity, is predatory is that if you're not creating competition, if you don't have a good sell-side advisor, they control the narrative regarding EBITDA. And they play games with EBITDA. EBITDA should be a completely objective conversation, but it's often very subjective.
Yeah.
If you send your numbers to 5 different DSOs, you're going to get 5 different EBITDA figures back. That shouldn't be the case.
Right.
But they're trying to manipulate EBITDA in order to manipulate value. The goal is to buy low and sell high. Every dollar of EBITDA is worth $6 to $10 in value. So controlling the narrative regarding EBITDA, fighting for every dollar in EBITDA that you can get is far more important and moves the needle far more than trying to control the narrative on multiple. So that's a big part of what we do in the valuation process, as well as pre-LOI and negotiations with DSOs, as well as during the quality of earnings process, post-LOI when they're doing their diligence, is to ensure that we get credit for the highest EBITDA number possible, because that's really what moves the needle, not the multiple.
And I've lived through this very recently in that we just got a $15 million loan to be able to recap our debt and buy new practices in our shared practices group, in our denture and implant group. And our investment bank, they're not private equity. It's not another DSO. Like, we're still in control of this. But our investment bank has based our compliance around practice level EBITDA. And so, that's in our favor. We don't have to subtract all the central costs.
Yeah, that's great.
It's great. So now, like, it's funny, but like, that is not our real EBITDA. Like, it's like, oh, this is kind of like a made up number that based on these individual practices, how we're doing as a whole, that determines if we're in compliance or not, if we can get access to more money and capital. And so we've been, and also, what they did and didn't count as EBITDA. We just went through all of this. Yep. You're absolutely right in that number is not as straightforward as a number as you would think it is.
Absolutely. Making sure that it's accurate and defensible.
Yes.
And as high as it can possibly be is the name of the game when we're talking about maximizing valuation.
It's kind of like we were talking about this yesterday in the event. What the banker that is talking to you at first says until it goes to underwriting, it's almost like what the multiple is until we actually fix what EBITDA gets counted and what isn't. That's like, okay, yeah, we'll get XYZ multiple, but what is the base, number that we're multiplying by? Ironically, there's far more play in that than we would think.
There's a lot of play pre-LOI before you accept an offer, but there's also a lot of games played post-LOI. So DSOs will, dangle that carrot. They'll give you what looks like a sexy offer up front.
Right.
And then once you accept an offer, you're going to move into the diligence process, what they call a quality of earnings process. And oftentimes they'll use a third-party accounting firm so that they can blame them when
They're the
EBITDA
bad guy.
number comes out light.
Yep.
And oftentimes they'll tell you, hey, your EBITDA's $500,000. We're going to bid a 7x multiple, $3.5 million valuation. You ink an LOI at that number, and then they beat the hell out of you for 3 months during the closing process to get through quality of earnings. And then they come back 2 weeks before close and they're like, I know we thought the EBITDA was $500,000, but we just got quality of earnings back and it's only $400,000. You're at a 7x multiple. We need to retrade the deal and reduce the valuation by $700,000.
Yeah.
So at that point, you've got a decision to make. Jesus, I'm tired. I just went through a crazy diligence process. I'm telling my team about the sale next week. Do I really want to back away from this process completely and start over with another DSO, or am I just going to go along with the flow? And that's where having somebody like us at the table, we're going to control that narrative. We're going to ensure that there's no retrade. And the way you do that is to create leverage. If they were in a competitive process pre-LOI with 10 bids and they screw around in the quality of earnings process and try to retrade the deal, we're going to politely remind them that there's still 9 buyers at the table that would be happy to buy this practice if you want to F around.
Right.
And that's the only way that you hold their feet to the fire and keep them honest.
I love it. Well, so if people are interested in learning more about you guys in between now and next episode, what's your guys' website? Where do they find more about McLaren and Associates?
Yeah, dentaltransitions.com is our website. And we have a lot of educational content, a lot of podcasts, webinars just like this, particularly on the DSO resources page. So I think that's a great place to start if you're looking to learn more about DSO transactions and this side of the space. People think I'm crazy, but I always give out my cell phone number. You know, I'm here as a resource to your listeners.
Cool.
So you want to text me, you want to call me. My number is 512-660-8505. You can also email me, Brannon, BRANNON, @dentaltransitions.com. You know, we use a soft sell approach. We're all about education. You know, we always do a discovery call with all of our potential clients just to get to know each other and talk about, you know, what are your goals? What does your practice look like? Does it make sense to even go down the next phase of the process, which is evaluation? You know, quantifying your EBITDA, quantifying what's possible if and when we were to go to market.
Perfect. Well, Brandon, I'm really grateful for you being here at this event, having these conversations, and I'm looking forward to talking more next week.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Talk to you next time on the Shared Practices podcast.